So it's good evening, everyone, and in morning also. And I'm glad that we gathered and you could join us at this series of seminars and workshops which we have at the Center for Urban History in Lviv, in Ukraine. Our series titled Urban History, Digital Infrastructures, Sharing Expertise and Networking Cities, which Center for Urban History in Lviv organizes with the support of the Center for Governance and Culture in Europe at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. And this series focuses on the methodological approach and connections between urban history and digital history and digital humanities. And we intend to emphasize the process of making our digital projects, which actually for users invisible. Yes, they see the end product, but we are actually those who create and struggle with a lot of things, and nobody sees it. So we want to make it visible, actually. So to see it open up this backstage, yes, of our project. And today I have pleasure to introduce Stephen Robertson, Professor of History at George Mason University, Associate Director at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. Professor Robertson is co-creator of Digital Harlem project, is actually the father of this project for ours, all digital projects, urban digital projects in Europe also, and ours, Lviv Interactive as well. So it was a great inspiration for us, and not only for us. Professor Robertson works with social and digital history of 20th century United States, and his current research devoted to mapping and analyzing the undercover investigation in period from Civil War to the Second World War. And today's lecture will be about the new publication, digital publication, titled History Unbound, Harlem in Disorders, as an example of using digital medium to present evidence and context. And Professor Robertson, we are waiting to hear more about the process and product also. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I really appreciate this invitation. I appreciate all of you coming out in what are obviously unusual and difficult times for you all. And I am impressed that you're continuing to pursue all of the important work that you're doing in conditions where you don't have power a lot of the time, which for digital projects is fairly vital. Process, I really am excited to talk about process. I kind of share your sense that we don't talk about it enough, and we don't really give people a clear sense of what goes behind the project. So, project I'm going to talk about today, Harlem and Disorder, a spatial history of how racial violence changed in 1935. So Harlem and Disorder is a multi-layered, hyperlinked narrative that connects different scales of analysis, individual events, aggregated patterns, and a chronological narrative. Now, just what that means and what the goals and the form of this project are, go back to 2009. That's the year that my collaborators and I at the University of Sydney launched Digital Harlem, a research tool we'd developed for our study of everyday life in New York City's Harlem neighborhood in the 1920s. The site was not a collection of sources. Instead, it paired a database of events and places identified in that material with Google Maps to allow their locations to be visualized. We used the site to look for patterns and relationships, which we then explored through a close reading of sources. We made the site public in large part because its interactivity allowed users to map whatever data they wanted. However, the site lacked any framework to help users without our familiarity with the sources and historiography to shape questions or to make sense of the maps that they created. Nor could users couple the visualizations with close reading as we did, as the sources were not part of the site. I'm just going to adjust things on my screens here a little bit so that I'm not looking away at my slides on the other side. So, all right. So we tried later to make the site more intelligible to a wider audience, adding a series of pages with information on the project, the map, and the sources. We also added links to the Digital Harlem blog, where I published posts exploring and contextualizing maps of places and events and summaries of our scholarly publications. As appendages to a site designed as a single page combining an interface to the database and a map, that material remained marginal to how most users engaged with the site. As we worked to extend the project into the 1930s, I began to explore how we might integrate analysis into the site and our visualizations. My move from Australia to lead the Roy Rosenzweig Centre for History and New Media at George Mason University both interrupted that work and exposed me to a range of new inspirations and options. When I returned to the project, I focused on the racial disorder in Harlem in 1935 as a subject for spatial analysis. A preliminary map of the events of the disorder in Digital Harlem had shown the violence had spread more widely and in a different pattern than described in existing accounts. Looking to build on Digital Harlem, I initially focused on incorporating the interpretation in a map. In effect, I was seeking to create a deep map, a concept that digital humanities scholars have been pursuing since the early 2000s. Aiming to bring humanistic concerns to mapping, a deep map is characterized by a multiplicity of sources used, of perspectives represented, of experiences captured, arranged on a map to allow users to craft their own path through the material, generating a variety of meanings. However, the deep map has remained largely the subject of conceptual and methodological discussions, like the books that I'm showing you here, rather than being made concrete. And now, in part, the absence of deep maps results from a lack of a means to create them. The software that's been developed to combine maps and interpretation enables only much more limited spatial narratives than deep maps. One of those platforms is StoryMap.js, a freely available software product created by the Knight Lab at Northwestern University, which offers the capability to link together a sequence of points on a map, annotating each text with images, videos, and hyperlinks. This, however, is just a single pathway. It doesn't allow you to really see an event in its full context, and it falls a long way short of conveying the kind of complex interpretation that goes into understanding something like a racial disorder. Esri's ArcGIS's story map platform offered a more expansive view, not a single pathway through a map, but a scrolling series of maps accompanied by a limited space for textual narratives, and has evolved in recent years into a more general purpose tool for linear multimedia presentations. However, this balance between textual narratives and maps, and increasingly between other multimedia contexts and maps, still doesn't allow for the kind of exploration of a map that the deep map idea was animated by. The final tool that was kind of out there available to as a possibility for building deep maps is Neatline, a plugin for Omeka developed by Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia, which initially seemed to me to have the most potential as a means of creating a spatial analysis of the disorder. It allows items in an Omeka collection to be represented on a map, not just as points, lines, and polygons, but all forms of vector data. Those features made it possible to annotate and mark up maps rather than limiting text to sidebars or pop-up windows. This is a prototype, an image of a prototype that I built of a spatial analysis of the riot in Neatline, which used annotations to elaborate connections between points on the map and a modular narrative argument and waypoints, links located in a sidebar that opened on a map and that used a timeline, which you can see at the bottom of this image, as a means of navigating the spatial narrative. Waypoints in Neatline can be associated with a zoom level centered on a specific location. Clicking on them moved you around the map. Annotation in the form of polygons and lines also shifted some of the argument into a visual form, directing attention to movement, direction, proximity, and connection. However, waypoints can accommodate only a limited amount of text, and the complexity of the narrative about the racial disorder required the waypoints to be broken into groups and appear on a series of maps, limiting the scope and effectiveness of the prototype as a spatial narrative, leaving it well short of the kind of deep map that it needed to be to convey interpretation. In addition, Neatline lacked the capacity to incorporate another element of interpretation missing from digital Harlem: how the data was created. As more digital historians adopted data-driven approaches in the years after the launch of Digital Harlem, which is almost 20 years old at this point, they developed a different approach than the social science methods which earlier quantitative historians had borrowed. Heterogeneous and ambiguous historical records do not fall forwardly into categories in a data model. In response, digital historians have adopted an iterative process to create data. They interact with their data sets interactively, enrich and enlarge them as research progresses. Each step of selection, enrichment, and classification represents a choice that is based on explorations and interpretations of the data. These interactions change the data. Crucially, that approach can demand deeper research into the meaningful messiness of the distinguishing features, overlaps, and similarities, which, as Harmony Bench and Kate Ellsworth have pointed out, reintroduces ontological complexity into data. It can also counter the dehumanization involved in the transformation of individuals into abstract categories and numbers. The process of manually curating data from archival materials draws us closely into the lived experiences they index as we grapple with the multiple and conflicting stories behind each data point and what each signifies. This engagement needs to be carried forward in our research, as Jessica Marie Johnson has emphasized, to infuse the drive for data with a corresponding concern with and for the humanity and souls of the people involved. So documenting this process of creating digital data requires more than the citation of a source or the general statements about method that accompany social science data sets or the method sections included in narratives. Such overviews of the process of analysis reveal little about the choices made about individual data points. They also lack the direct connection to the narrative needed for the interpretation to be read in relation to the data on which it's based. So, facing the limits of the software tools to create spatial narratives and the need to make transparent how I created the data to map the racial disorder in Harlem, I decided to shift away from trying to present my interpretation on a map and to look for another digital format. In doing so, I brought my project into conversation with efforts to reimagine the historical monograph for the digital age. So this leads us to the form ultimately that this analysis took, which is a digital monograph called Harlem and Disorder. Now, this reimagining of the book, when people saw the possibilities of the digital medium, was something that began in the early ages of the World Wide Web, when historians recognized that the medium provided by computers offered ways to incorporate different media and weave form and content together beyond what was possible in a print book. So as early as 1989, Orville Burton wrote about works that would allow scholars to analyze each other's data firsthand, since a database will be included with a book disc. And that's a quote, obviously, that goes back to a vision of CD-ROMs as the vehicle for digital history. Roy Rosenzweig and Stephen Breyer elaborated further possibilities in 1994 when they described an electronic textbook with vast data that could easily be located with search and quickly navigated using links. Edward Ayres proposed a digital archive and linked text to create hypertextual history that can be arrayed and understood in multiple sequences and layers. In the same year, 1999, Robert Darnton published another model of how to exploit these possibilities. Structured in layers arranged like a pyramid, his electronic book augmented a top narrative layer with thematic accounts, documentation, historiography, suggestions for classroom uses, and commentary. However, at the turn of the 21st century, the pioneering efforts to present interpretation using the digital medium, fueled by those ideas, were generally dismissed by historians. The form of argument required by the print book has proved to be very deeply rooted in the profession. The selective inclusion of evidence was defended as part of what readers expected, and linear arguments as the form which readers were trained to follow. 20 years later, historians' shift to digital research practices has spurred new interests in creating a form of monograph using the digital medium and new opportunities for their publication. The way in which we find primary sources has changed significantly. Archival sources can be identified online by consulting archival websites and digitized finding aids, and less often digitized collections, making it possible to explore more archives in the same time devoted to research. Visits to those collections with digital cameras result in thousands of images to be analysed later, rather than smaller stacks of photocopies and notes of reading and analysis done in the archive. Large digital repositories of newspapers, periodicals, and journals provide both more access to far more material than could be read in print or microfilm, and search tools that rapidly deliver specific information. The increasingly large amounts of information produced by this digital research and the need to put search results in context make necessary a collective change in the ways in which historians approach the level of citation needed to establish a scholarly claim. The lack of progress towards a new practice reflects in part that existing techniques of presenting evidence rely more on trust than documentation. Notes refer to original documents that the reader generally will not be able to read. Bibliographic references mention books that the reader most often can find only in specialized libraries. Quotations of fragments selected by the historian with no means for the reader to know the entire text or documents from which they're excerpted. Such reliance on trust seems increasingly at odds with the spread of disinformation and with the need to distinguish evidence-based scholarship from the output of machine learning algorithms and AI chatbots. In response to these changes and the ongoing challenges of publishing academic monographs in the digital age, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation here in the United States supported a range of initiatives by university presses to publish digital forms of the monograph, including this digital project series published by Stanford University Press, in which Harlem in Disorder appears, alongside a range of other peer-reviewed publications that are available online only and open access. What was useful to my project is that the immersive and interactive properties of the digital medium, highlighted by those old ideas about how to reimagine the historical monograph, offered ways to combine interpretation and the documentation of my data in a form that conveyed the complexity of the disorder in a way that obviously maps are very good at doing. The digital medium offered the capacity to store and present larger quantities of information than I could in print. Where print requires selectivity, the digital medium is inclusive. Direct access to sources cited to support an argument is only the starting point for those possibilities. Evidence can be included in addition to what was cited, putting citations in the context of all the sources gathered in a historian's research, or even extending to putting that research in the context of the collections from which it was drawn. Sources can also be placed in the context of discussions of how they were identified and analysed and how the argument was constructed. The choices and compromises historians make as we winnow evidence through finer and finer grids of note-taking, narrative, and analysis as the abstracted patterns take on a fixity of their own. In other words, an immersive medium allows for the discursive footnotes increasingly rare in print books, and thereby allows for a research narrative alongside the argument. For secondary sources, These inclusive possibilities provide a way of addressing the politics of citation, a means to a more expansive, generous, and just practice. Notes that can include more texts remove a justification for exclusion and a focus on canonical texts. Longer notes can better capture the complexities of scholarly community and exchange. Arguments can be positioned within a field, for example, by describing their relationship to other works rather than simply listing those works has become the norm in print footnotes. Scholarly networks that less directly influence an argument can be addressed rather than being implied in acknowledgements that are separate from the text. All of this information can be assembled and connected in formats other than notes at the bottom of a page, end of a chapter or book, or bibliography separate from the text. Links can open up pages, open notes and pop-up windows on top of the text, in a window alongside one containing the text, or in a new separate window. In conceiving a digital form for my interpretation and argument, I return to the vision Robert Darnton offered in 1999 of a publication structured in layers arranged like a pyramid. He conceived those layers as augmentations of a top narrative layer, the concise account of the subject, as he described it, providing thematic accounts, documentation, historiography, suggestions for classroom uses, and commentary. Adapting that framework to a data-driven project, I reconceived those layers in terms of scale. The top layer in my project, the top layer in Harlem Disorder is a chronological narrative. A second layer of pages examine categories and subcategories of events and the people involved in them. Those groupings aggregate events in the disorder at different scales, extending the spatial grouping of events provided by the map. Rather, the individual events of the disorder and the individuals involved in them are the further layer, the events layer in that diagram. Rather than a data set, this layer is a set of pages that describe the interpretive choices made in creating each data point from multiple sources. Included are data that cannot be fitted to arguments made in the narrative, events without locations and timing, events that are not on maps, and events that appear only as prosecutions in court, neither in the chronology or on the map. The final layer are the sources, each a page to which all the notes citing that source are linked. The sources themselves are not part of the site. They can fit naturally into those note pages, but the published sources are still under copyright, and access to the legal records and other archival sources is restricted. Crucially, this structure fitted my argument about the complexity of the disorder, which required reconstructing and interpreting the details of individual events, and fitted my concern to make transparent the interpretations involved in the creation of data from uncertain and ambiguous sources. Now, unlike the case with deep maps and spatial narratives, a digital platform existed from which to build such a layered argument. After experimenting with building relationships from scratch in WordPress and HTML, I turned to Scalar, an open source digital authoring and publishing platform developed by the Alliance for Networking Visual Culture at the University of Southern California. Now, I hadn't initially considered Scalar, as the publications I'd encountered built using it were essentially ebooks. Arguments that followed the form of a book but used Scalar to incorporate digital media that couldn't be published in print. However, when I went back to the platform, I recognized that Scalar actually offers the ability to create other forms of arguments, as it's based on reconceiving the database in humanities terms. A speculative remapping of rigidly logical structures towards more conceptual ones, creating possibilities for many-to-many relations of diverse and varied kinds, to use the words of Tara McPherson, part of the team that developed Scalar. As a platform for imagining relation, the software's flexible structure allowed the varieties of sequences and grouping of content that the argument I was making in Digital Harlem required. So Scalar is designed to incorporate elements, pages, and media, and then offers a set of relations that you can create between those elements: paths, tags, links, and notes. The path semantic element offered in Scalar provides a way to construct the top narrative layer of Harlem and Disorder. Paths in Scalar are linear sets of content, given the added flexibility of being able to contain other paths. I use paths to structure a series of pages that provide a chronological narrative, dividing it into 3 chapters made up of varying lengths. The first section presented the events of the night of the disorder, with each page covering a 30-minute period and featuring an interactive map of the events in that time. So this is a screenshot. You can't get a large scrolling page on a screenshot very easily, but this is a screenshot of one of those pages, the period from 9:30 to 10 p.m. on the nights of the disorder. All of the event pages, as I said, are anchored by interactive maps of the events that fall in that time frame. It's accompanied by a whole range of media. The second section in this analysis spanned the prosecutions that followed in the months after this order, and the final section focused on the investigation that culminated in a report submitted to New York City's mayor more than a year later. Scalar's semantic element, sorry, let's try that again. Scalar's tag semantic element provided a way to link these layers. In other platforms, clicking on a tag takes a user to a list of all the pages that have that tag. In Scalar, by contrast, clicking on a tag takes you to a page. As a page, a tag can be not just a means of connection and collection, but also a site of analysis and interpretation. Here again, Scalar provides additional flexibility that tags themselves can have tags to create subcategories and multiple connections between elements of the argument. In Harlem and Disorder, tags link pages in the chronological narrative to pages on individual events, the set of arrows on the left of this diagram. Those pages in turn include tags that link events to different categories of which they are part, effectively placing those individual events in context and grouping them for analysis at different scales. On pages for individual events, a tag classifies an event as one of 9 types, and additional tags group it based on different features, such as who was involved, the character of the location, and whether an arrest or prosecution followed. A number in brackets at the end of the tag indicates how many events are in that category, providing a glimpse of the shape of the patterns in the disorder. A tag for the time period when the event occurred, if that's known, connects an event to the chronological narrative. When the time's not known, there are links in the pages to pages in the chronological narrative that are possible times when it occurred. So that what we're looking at here is the page on an assault on a police officer and the tag list for that assault that connects it out to the chronological narrative and to the categories that it's part of that place it in a larger context. Police arrested James Hughes, a 24-year-old black shoe repairer, originally from Georgia, for assaulting Detective Roach. Arrests are a separate category of event from the events that allegedly led police taking an individual in custody to counter the tendency to assume that those who are arrested are guilty. In Harlem in 1935, that's a particularly questionable assumption, given the practice of arresting those on the street as a means of dispersing crowds and the discriminatory treatment of black residents by the predominantly white police officers. Pages for individual arrests, like the page for James Hughes here, have tags grouping them in relation to the legal process as well as the chronological narrative. The charge, in which court's prosecutions occurred, the outcome, and for those convicted, the sentence imposed. And the Hughes case is one that worked its way all the way through the legal system, so that's a particularly dense web of connections between that case and the legal process. The label for an individual event, where possible, names the participants, as this one does in identifying James Hughes, but also can include the name of the owner or staff member of a looted or damaged store, or the name of an individual killed, injured, or arrested. In some cases, probation department files and census and draft records provide details of the lives of those individuals. Although fragmentary, such information offers some counterbalance to the reliance on aggregate numbers to describe the disorder in the existing literature on Harlem in 1935, and the broader tendency of data to dehumanization. These individual event pages discuss each of the sources in which information on the event appears, the agreement and disagreement amongst those sources, and decisions about what information to use and why, and about how to categorize an event. The sources referenced in those discussions of how the data was created are another layer linked through Scalar's note relationship. The notes are links in the text on a page that open pop-up windows, which when clicked on can display a combination of the title, description, and content of the link page, and a link to open that page. I used the note function in Scalar to display citations only, and in limited cases, some biographical information about the person who was the source of the information, with a link to the note page, so as akin to footnotes. The difference with doing this in Scalar is that the note pages also serve as an index to the sources not available in a print book, in the form of links to all the pages that cite each source and to the category of sources to which it's a part. So in a way that I think is incredibly useful, you can see all of the places where I use a particular source and then go back, in this case, to the newspaper from which the story comes to look at the broader context of stories and information produced in that newspaper. If I'd had time, I would have built out those sections on individual newspapers, for example, to include an analysis of the way that they covered the riot. But for complicated reasons to do with the way Stanford University Press operated, I wasn't able to actually do that in the end. But it's an important kind of opportunity that Scalar offers to really interrogate the nature of sources alongside the broader analysis and use of them. Clicking on one of the tags that leads back up into that middle aggregated event pages takes you to a page that gathers all the events in that category, which appear as tags on that page. The individual events, in effect, appear in the context of other events with which they share features. So on the left there, you've got the breakdown of the broad categories of events in which I classified what was going on in the riot. In the middle is the page on assaults, which you'll see as one of those event categories. And then I've pulled out of that on the right the various subcategories that exist. So in this example for assaults, which is one of the 9 broad event categories for the disorder, there are 15 related subcategories. 6 represent forms of assault, 4 are based on the identity of the alleged victim, and 3 are based on the police response and the resulting legal proceedings. There's also a category for assaults by police to highlight a gap in the data. Despite the absence of specific incidents of violence by police, there are multiple references in the sources to police beating and shooting at people on the streets. Visualizations of these groupings were created with a typeface of silhouettes of people to infuse that aggregated information with a reminder of the humanity of its subjects. It's very easy, if I turn these into simple bar graphs, to just look at them as some sort of quantitative collection. One of the things I felt was really important was to remember that this data is about people, and therefore to kind of find a visual vocabulary for presenting these aggregations that continued to put that that kind of humanity of the data right in front of us. What the arrows on this diagram are trying to convey is not simply the kinds of connections that Scalar has allowed me to build between the layers of my narrative. It also presents to the kinds of ways that this interactive structure lets a reader make their own way through this narrative. Lets them follow the chronological narrative, then depart from it at a point of interest to focus on a specific event and arrive at a page that contains tags that link to more information about events related to that event in some way and notes that link to sources. Clicking on tags and moving across individual events and different groupings of events embodies the complexity of the disorder, while also highlighting how the shape of that argument is the product of choices I made about how to categorize events identified in the sources. Reading in this way, the argument is explored through a process of weaving, drawing threads out of the narrative and interlacing them until they form a pattern that shows the complex mix of forms into which racial violence changed in 1935 to create a wide-ranging challenge to white economic and political power. Now, while unfamiliar, the different ways that digital monographs like Digital Harlem and Disorder need to be read do facilitate understandings of historical practices in a way that print monographs do not. What print monographs make readily available is an argument. The relationship between that argument and the evidence supporting it is difficult to interrogate given the limited picture of a historian's research that can be provided within the bounds of a print book. This creates a challenge for many readers that academics most often encounter in teaching. Experienced historians can flesh out information provided in footnotes to interrogate the relationship between argument and evidence, drawing on their knowledge of practices and sources left opaque by the constraints of print. Other readers, including our students, cannot. They identify and react to a book's argument with little consideration of the evidence on which it's based. The access to sources and their interpretation provided by a digital monograph like Harlem and Disorder makes it easier for readers to explore the relationship between argument and evidence. And inviting audiences of different levels of preparation, varied curiosities, and diverse physical and cognitive abilities into the oftentimes opaque practices of professional historical production, as a reviewer of Harlem and Disorder put it. Likewise, giving readers choices in how they explore an argument while requiring more from them than following a single linear path also makes more visible how historians investigate a historical question and construct an interpretation. As history unbound, freed of the restrictions imposed by the page and the number of pages that binding can hold together, the digital monograph thus does more than allow a historian to incorporate the scale of digital research and fit form to argument. It also changes the reader's relationship to that argument and expands their opportunities to test its evidence. If diminishing the historian's voice in favor of incorporating their practice departs from how we typically define humanities scholarship, such a shift seems more compelling in our current moment than when historians first explored the digital medium over 30 years ago. Faced with a wave of AI applications that deliver information without sources and make claims without evidence, the digital monograph offers historians possibilities for distinguishing their scholarship as evidence-based and highlighting the relationship between claims and evidence. Okay, thank you. That is all I have to say.
Thank you very much. We heard the argument, actually, yes, which are in favor of digital monography, of course. Yes, and especially with those who works with space. Yes, for me, example, I still struggle what I need to do with my dissertation and how I want to present it, because it's very spatial, and actually I'm really thinking now about the possibilities that you showed, and maybe it will be the better choice to do this.
Well, we work a lot here at George Mason with our PhD students on digital forms for dissertation. So our department has developed some guidelines for what kind of form a digital dissertation can take. There are a lot of departments in the United States who will not let students do digital dissertations, but digital history has been a big enough part of the department at Mason for 30 years that that we feel comfortable enough with what's possible and very aware of what you can't, how hard it is to get things like spatial analysis onto pages, that we're actively supporting our students in doing exactly what you just described.
Yeah, I lacked this. Yes, but still, the result is incredible actually, with the links and how we can serve, yes, serene and explore the project, and to choose the layer which we want to explore, the first or last. My question, the first one, which I prepared and thought about your previous projects, yes, because we have also this long discussion here in Lviv, at the center, about our project, which is also 20 years, not 20, 17 years old, and how to make it alive, and to support it, and to actually to how we can um, how we need to change it when the technology is while the technology changing, yes, and it's the ongoing process for years, and each 10 years actually we are making technical changes to save the data, but to protect, to improve the technical, the back end of the project. What was with the digital Harlem? Have you decided that you are stopping to change it? And yes, I think I saw that there is the some parts of that project appeared in this monograph. Yes, that it has some connections, but still, what we can do with this, the history of our digital project.
Look, I think that is a huge problem that we don't really have, well-established solutions from. So the Rosenzweig Centre here at which is not where Digital Harlem is, also has 20 to 30-year-old projects that we're struggling to maintain. These projects were all funded by grant funds, which is fairly typical in the United States for this kind of project. And that really means that there are not resources to update them. There was a moment sort of 5 years ago when some of those funders realized that projects needed to sustain it. And they were providing money for people to update projects, and some of the projects at the center were able to get that money and went through an update. Digital Harlem has never been updated, and there are no, as things stand right now, there are no resources to do it. It's particularly complicated because it's still hosted in Australia at an institution that I'm no longer affiliated with. Now, some of my collaborators there are retiring, and so the project's kind of connection to the institution is becoming very frayed. It's also built uh, on a platform called Hurist, which was sort of developed by people at the University of Sydney who are also not at the University of Sydney. So that project is largely frozen in the form in which it was created, almost 15 years ago, because there's no resources to move it. Now, thankfully, as they've developed the Hurist platform, they've developed better ways for us to get the data out of it, because the early versions of Hurist, we couldn't get the data out. And so we've been able to pull the data out in various ways and have kept it until things sort of got until the current government in the United States effectively ended federal funding for the humanities. I was looking for money to expand Digital Harlem. It needs a total redesign. You know, it's a pioneer, and therefore it means that it doesn't do a whole lot of things that we now realize need to be done. But but at the moment, we can't do anything about that. So if you're able to sort of update it every 10 years or so, that's an enormous benefit. I think that there are often hard choices about doing that. Not every project, I think, needs to be saved, needs to have a further life. As long as you can get the data out of a project, I do think there's also um, an increasing recognition that simply presenting data outside of platforms is obviously much more straightforward to maintain and sustain than sustaining elaborate platforms. And so there is a bit of a move to separate data and platforms and preserve platforms. That's one of the things I'm considering for Digital Harlem. As I said, I've pulled the data out of the website, now that that's possible. And so at some point, if the site were to go away, then I would probably put the data up. At the moment, the university is maintaining it. In fact, this week I'm exchanging emails with them. They would like to move Digital Harlem into Omeka S, which is a extremely kind of wrong-headed idea because the entire kind of structure of Digital Harlem is not compatible with the structure of Omeka S, and it says unfortunate things about the people who are making that decision. So I guess if I had to sum that up, this is an early enough project that we never thought about that. We never thought about, oh, hold on a minute, this technology is going to change, this is going to be outdated. We've been really lucky in that we've been able to maintain this site's connection to Google Maps. And there's a whole generation of spatial projects created around the time of Digital Harlem that have died because of changes in the Google API. Now, our developers and the way they've used it meant that the site has survived. But in some ways, it should already be dead. But we made no plans for that. Weren't even thinking about it. Um, and when we were, we just have not had the resources to do it. It's an enormous investment, and in a grant-funded world, there's no way to do it. And so I think we need, so I think that a lot of the planning for people who don't have long-term resources is about preserving data, not platforms, and also flattening sites and getting them off database sites. So the strategy for a lot of the sites at the center is to flatten them. That's not an option, obviously, with Digital Harlem, where the entire functionality is built on being able to search the database. But a lot of other projects built on database derived CMS platforms don't need that search function. And so the flat page is the way we can do that. But um, so in some ways, I'm an exam. Digital housing is just very lucky to still be here. And and hope whether it ever gets redeveloped and whether it survives long term is going to depend on whether I can persuade somebody to pay for it as it goes down the road. I think if we develop that project now, then you develop sustainability plans. You try and limit the dependencies. You make sure you can get your data out. You think about a future without funding. But I also think we have to consider a future where things just break and go away and kind of reimagine digital projects as perhaps something ephemeral. I guess to take it back a little bit to the overall kind of argument here, where our sense that these things should survive in some form similar to the way we built them is a very book-based view of the world. And I think thinking about working in the digital medium is maybe also thinking about not preserving things in a single form, that you preserve elements of them like the data, not necessarily like the platform. I should say, I guess, that the other way I'm involved in that is that Stanford University Press, which published Harlem in Disorder, has archived copies of the publication as it existed when it was published. And so they've both archived the Scalar platform and all the contents of the site as part of their kind of commitment to a sustainable model. Um, the one interesting frustration of that is, and if you find your way behind the front page of Harlem and Disorder, you can see links. But they had us record screen tours of the sites. They had us generate bibliographies of all of the content of the site, and then they archived all of the files in various forms. The one thing that frustrates me about that is that freezes the form of Harlem and Disorder. What digital publication should allow us to do is create something dynamic that we can change and update. A digital monograph should be able to engage with things that are related to it that are published later. I should be able to go in and put the project in conversation with those things, and update it in those ways. But preserving it for the press meant freezing it like a book. And though, so again, their expectations from a book get in the way of really taking advantage of what the project can do and accepting its limitations.
Yeah. We actually now at the moment when we thinking about, because Lviv Interactive works at the custom made CMS for 17 years, and we're thinking about transferring it to macOS.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if we ever enough of what we can lose in this process. Perhaps it will be easier to build a new project actually with new connections, not to change to transfer. Yes, it's to
Yeah, that's a
the
really tough question. Yeah, I mean, it really involves, a deep dive into your functionality versus Omeka S's. The reason Omeka S doesn't work for Digital Harlem, which is what I'm trying to convince the people in Sydney at the moment, is that Digital Harlem is much more about relations. It's a down to the roots relational database. And while you can create relations in Omeka S, it's not fundamental, it's not privileging relations. It's in fact, it's privileging individual items. And because it's a digital collection platform, it's not, those items don't really work as a data point. So to turn a data point into an Omeka S item and then try to reestablish the relationships is really convoluted. And I think because people expect Omeka S projects to be collections of material, they're going to be very confused to find that, in a Digital Harlem Omeka S site, that item wouldn't be a document. It would be a piece of information derived from a document. So it would be a fundamentally mismatched with what Omeka is. And so I think that that's the challenge. If you're working with data derived from sources, then I think Omeka S that's not really what Omeka S is designed for. If you're working with documents and sources, i.e., if you're working with a digital collection, then Omeka S will work. But you can ram data into Omeka S. I just think it kind of misrepresents what it is you've got because it's, an item, even the language that the vocabulary that Omeka S uses is the vocabulary of a digital collection, not the vocabulary of a data set and the data relations. By the same token, I think custom CMSs are a recipe for stress. I think that they definitely require more work. And if you move to an open source platform like Omeka S, there are at least other people working on the platform. And my experience with custom CMSs and is that they become really challenging when the people who design them move on. Because custom really means it makes sense to the person who designed it, and it doesn't really make sense to anybody else. And so the handoff of a custom CMS is very, very challenging. And you hopefully have developers who document what they do very carefully, but if it's custom, you're on your own. So the advantage of moving it to something like a macOS is that there is a community of people working on it. And so you're not doing all the work yourself, but that's a harder decision to make if you can't map what you do onto the way that Omeka S is designed. And I do think that And again, the people who built Omeka were at the Rosensweig Centre when I ran it. I learned a lot about that site, and it's still, they're still fundamentally view it as a digital collection based site, and they've made, the apparatus for working with digital collections more and more sophisticated. What you can do with metadata in Omeka is streets ahead of what you could do with metadata in Omeka. The multi-site function is incredibly powerful in a variety of ways, but it's still collections of items as the and they've built more ways to build relationships in, but most of those are kind of as add-ons to the core functionality, which isn't really about building relations between data. I'm working with students in a class at the moment, where they're using legal records for a local court, and we're building out, both a digital collection of those records and creating data from it. And it's been very interesting just to kind of struggle with the limited kinds of relationships that you can build into the metadata schema, and how much more complex that is to do in some ways than to build tables in a relational database.
Mhm. Thank you. There's more questions that I have to our transfer. Yes, but still we have time. We have a lot of time. We think that we have.
Good.
Perhaps we have the question from our audience. Yes, Sophia, your mic is off. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, and yeah, Digital Harlem was such a highlight, and I remember discovering that and then going into Harlem physically, and that was incredibly, like incredible experience for on a personal and professional level. And I think that your comment, actually your answer to Roxolana question in a way, uh, add humbleness into our profession, because we put things, we use fragments and then put things into the story from fragments, and then how like the story becomes fragments again. I mean, in this long preservation, there is something sobering and humbling in accessing your creative and part of our profession. Actually, I kind of have maybe three common questions. One is about quantity and quality of sources you need, because the sources you work with are really abundant, right? So we talk about newspapers and court cases, right? So, and I don't know, in a way, like what type, I mean, and that also limits the part of history in time and the part of history in space that we can use this type of tool, right? Because if you have very few sources, can you work with very few sources? Or if you have very diverse sources, which are not similar, right? So they are very, so that's kind of, on the density and availability of, and then how that limits, what kind of, what can get a digital monograph publication in a way. I also, the second was about modes of reading. And I mean, in a way, it resonates a lot about this transparency of how you cook the story, right? In a way but did you have an experience from people who are not into profession or not into this kind of wanting just to read a story? Kind of like, and I mean, even if you think about paper publication, as we have this publication that have footnotes at the end of the page and footnotes which are half of the book at the end, right? And then it gives like two options for reader who is interested, like a professional, saying what archive, where, and what historiographic discussion. And then you go to the end, and then if somebody publishes, okay, we want to prioritize the text so that people are not distracted. Some people don't want to be distracted with half-page footnotes, right? So, I mean, in a way, so when you were designing and thinking of the digital monograph, was there how to read the story enjoyably, like in a way that is a good read, like you take on the metro, on the bus, and just kind of enjoy it. So that's probably, yeah, like this option, or whether this then it's just for that you need a paper or digital paper. And then the third question is about reader, sources, readers, and then authors. We're still partly living in this pyramid where the pinnacle of pyramid is a single author book for which you get a tenure. Anyway, okay, so it's for America, but generally, there's still this, we're challenging that and thinking there's certain questions, uh, certain questions or certain part of human experience is beyond one man or one woman work. Yeah, it's a collective. And that's how this, in your experience, how this multi-authored and also multi-type of authors, because authorship can be different, can be the text, but also can be authorship can come with a different type of work. And so how you acknowledge that, but at the same time, in a way that still does not confuse the reader at the very end. So these are like my, but thank you very much. It's fascinating work, and thank you very much for all the work that you did. It's just incredible.
I
Thank you.
appreciate I really appreciate that, and and again, it's very humbling to hear that that people were inspired by what we did in a given that we were sort of groping around in the dark. So the quality and quantity of sources. I mean, did what was really powerful to me about Digital Harlem and that I've carried through into the other projects is the way mapping lets you use fragmentary sources, and so that Digital Harlem is built out of fragments, and newspaper sources generally are extremely fragmentary, particularly when you're trying to find things tied to space. So the real powerful of that and the real power you know um, of mapping based on databases is the value that it gives to fragmentary sources. So I think that in some ways this is the particular version of this work I do is all about fragments. The the extension of that in Harlem and Disorder, the transparency that I was interested was also about kind of grappling with those fragmentary sources. The newspaper reporting of the events in the disorder is massively fragmented and contradictory, and so coming up with an event, locating it, describing it, involves an awful lot of decisions about how to put together those fragments and which ones to accept and not accept. So in some ways, the digital monograph is about, if Digital Harlem kind of displayed the fragments and showed the power of kind of collecting fragments. What I was interested in Harlem and Disorder was really making transparent the project of building a story out of fragments, and not so much gaps in what but sources that tell you bits and pieces of a story and don't always agree on what happened, and so how we build a story out of that. And I think that's always been, as somebody who really began as a social historian, that's always been one of my kind of uneasiness about writing narrative, is that we tend to paste over all of that uncertainty and ambiguity and the decisions we make to build a story, to create a narrative. And I've always found sorting out those fragments to be one of the things that excites me most about being a historian. And so I've always kind of wanted to make that part of the story. And I think that's also very much what doing legal history of the kind I do involves as well. I read, actual court records, not decisions. And, those are also just collections of documents that don't immediately tell a coherent story, that you have to sort out a story from all of those things. So I I think a lot of the history we do is fragments. If you want to tell a rich micro history of an individual event like this disorder, then you need a certain kind of quantity of sources. Digital Harlem, I think, is the opposite end. It's telling you that you can tell a story out of a lot of sources that on the first pass through seem to be fragments. You know, 3 lines on a traffic accident in Harlem doesn't seem to mean much, but if you put all the traffic accidents together and then you connect them to all of the discussions about it, suddenly there's a story about, about how people are moving around the neighborhood. So I think you can do kind of both. And but if you're going to tell a story out of fragments, you need that kind of layer of your research story, the layer of how you created the data that I got really interested in creating for Harlem and Disorder that's missing from Digital Harlem. It's very, it displays the fragments, it suggests stories, but to build a story out of Digital Harlem requires kind of interpretive work that, we didn't put on the sites and that, in the end I decided I couldn't get on a map. And so I kind of moved it out and into these other digital formats to put it together. So you can do different kinds of things, but if I had to choose, but either way, I think the digital lets us do powerful things with more fragmentary sources than we're used to working with in the kinds of scholarship we produce for print. The modes of reading is really interesting. And it was one of the things that kind of put an end to the early experiments with digital monographs. Historians basically in the United States refused to read things that were not linear narratives. They kind of looked at it and said, where is the argument? Because it wasn't laid out in the way they were used to doing. Um, I think people have spent 30 years clicking links between those experiments and now. And so I think there's a little bit more comfort with linearity. But Harlem and Disorder is a compromise. There's a traditional chronological narrative layer, exactly of the kind that I would have produced in a book, probably more detailed than they would have let me do in print. But my kind of compromise was to provide that layer as a way for readers to kind of make their way through the text. And then, my goal was to try and lure them off that narrative and encourage them to do it. But ultimately, I came to terms with the fact that I don't think people are ready to read a truly non-linear narrative, or at least academic readers aren't. And so that, I don't see Harlem and Disorder by any means as, the end of the process of imagining a digital monograph. I very much approached this project as something that needed to be recognizable as a monograph to academic readers so that they would engage with it as a book, not as this other thing called a digital project, but that also did things, tried to also show them how you could actually do a better monograph by making it digital. So it's very much a compromise and it's very much trying to move people towards recognizing the value and of both creating and reading in a different kind of mode. And I am absolutely certain that there are some readers who just read the chronological narrative and don't engage with those other kind of layers. I think it's kind of hard to do, but it's there. I mean, and the reason I did that was because this really was a project created for academics. And one of the things that I've done since it was published is lobby to have it reviewed as a book. So what's happened in at least some American academic history journals is they've created new set review sections for digital projects, for things that are sort of digital but are not books. And the one thing that I did not want to happen to Harlem and Disorder was for it to be reviewed as a digital project. I wanted it to be reviewed as a kind of book. And so I've managed to get a couple of journals to do that, and I'm still lobbying other journals to put this in their book review section. So the American Historical Review, it's in there as a book review, and it's a wonderful review. The reviewer there really engaged with what I was trying to do. I think, to kind of the first question, that review was really interesting because the reviewer was really interested. One of his major comments was the way that it made him completely rethink um, what a historical monograph could be, and also made him absolutely um, terrified of trying to do that with his own book, kind of like trying to do it with your own dissertation. You know, it's interesting, but he wasn't certain he could kind of try and do it for himself. That's kind of exactly what the project's built to do, to be recognizable enough to cause people to say, well, okay, um, these are things I can do. And the point that I was making, I really do think that increasingly print books are going to be unable to convey what we do as historians. We can write narratives, but how we did that research is just not going to fit, is not going to fit into a book in kind of the same way. So I'm also hoping that there are more people open to this as they spend again more time researching online, not just reading online. If you're used to being able to engage with a source online when you're reading about it, then maybe people will begin to think that actually that should be part of how a monograph works. Um, Authorship, which kind of goes the same way. I think this is a little bit of a generational thing. The American Historical Association, which is our overarching professional organization for historians in the United States, has over the last 10 years very slowly taken steps towards recognizing um, scholarship in forms beyond the book. And so they've now got a range of policies to kind of highlight how that should be assessed for things like tenure and promotion, but also just they publish definitions of scholarship that are more expansive than print. And multiple authorship is part of that. And I think that there are more historians um, who work and think about their scholarship in those multiple kinds of forms than there were 30 years ago when we were doing something like Digital Harlem. Now, that doesn't mean that every historian or every history department is able to work through that. Um, it doesn't mean particularly that the senior people in the profession who often make decisions will go that way. But I think there's been an enormous amount of progress along those lines relative to where we started out. And so, in fact, often when I'm asked for advice by junior scholars who are kind of being warned a bit about doing anything different in their dissertations or their books, um, I say that those fears are largely groundless. There's all sorts of infrastructure, all sorts of professional resources, all sorts of professional support to do other things. And I think often they're told that it's a risk by people who don't know how to do it and don't want them to do it. So the biggest challenge, I think, for junior scholars who want to do digital history in the United States at the moment is advisors and departments where there's nobody who does it, not because the broader profession doesn't support it. Um, so I think all of those frameworks allow for it. Multi-authorship is still tricky. We had um, we had less difficulty with Digital Harlem than we did with the book about gambling in Harlem that we published from the work we did on Digital Harlem. That book was co-authored by four of us. Um, but the press and the marketing department of the publisher couldn't handle that. So they ran lots of ads for that book with only one author attached to it. And a lot of library catalog entries only list one author and just ignore the other three of us because there's a lot of infrastructure set up for books that doesn't deal with multiple authors. That's also an interesting challenge with um, getting Harlem and Disorder into library catalogs as books. If getting it reviewed as a book is a challenge in terms of making people aware of it as something that they should think about as a book. Um, what I didn't expect was that we can't get it in. We've struggled to get it into library catalogs as a book. And the issue here in the United States is that the Library of Congress generates library catalog records for publications, which are then used by libraries across the country. And they have an ebook category that we thought that publications like Harlem and Disorder would fit into. But the Library of Congress's definition of an ebook requires there to be a print version as well as an electronic version. And so for publications like the one that Stanford published that Harlem and Disorder is part of, there is no print book. So it can't get an ebook catalog entry from the Library of Congress, which means that most libraries don't ingest it. Interestingly, I spent a lot of time trying to find a workaround for that. And I eventually found one that the publisher had missed, which is that there are catalogs of open access publications that Stanford University Press is part of that are ingested by libraries who don't otherwise capture open access publications. So we've got Harlem and Disorder into at least several hundred academic libraries who use this open access publication database to identify things to include in their catalogs. And so it goes in as a book in all of the Stanford publications as well, because they're open access. Even though the Library of Congress still won't treat them as books. And the Library of Congress's argument when Stanford University Press went to them was that there's just not enough of these things that are ebooks that don't have print for them to create a record type for them. So, you know, we have to keep pushing people to do it in order to get it out there, to get people to recognize it. And again, that matters to me because people are not going to consider this kind of thing until they encounter it more often. And I think what's happened to a lot of our digital projects is that they have a kind of recognition they didn't have 30 years ago, but it's a recognition as something other than the thing that most people think of as scholarship. And so now our challenge is to move them in and put them in front of people as equivalent to a book, not as a separate sort of thing. So very long answers, but very rich questions.
Thank you. It's a lot to think about, right? So, and yeah, that's it's a lot to think about. Also, our living interactive, which is like a agglomeration of projects in a way, right? And it's also how how you always think that it's what is better to have large funds or long funds.
Yeah.
Right. So, and how you have it's rather a project of having, small funds, but also long one that you could really like continue and continue. Yeah. And in a way, how this place, which is academic, but it's not also academic. Yeah. And for whom and how you create the knowledge, but also academic is not also single one, right? Because there are different historiographies for different academias, right? So that and how help find a way of, not making them one, but actually connecting and coexisting in as non-hierarchical way as possible. And that's, and I was like, when you were speaking about this argument, because coming from a different academic, you don't start, when I was taught history, it's like you have to lay out the description and then you do the conclusion and no argument, you don't start, and then it was, like reviling myself, you actually think, okay, what comes in your end, you have to put at the beginning for more Anglo-American.
Exactly.
So basically you have to, and then reframe that, and in a way, you actually can do it both ways.
Okay.
It's and then it matters what you write, and then of course there are different ways of doing research and producing knowledge, and then revising this knowledge again and again, and but how to have this constellation of different and for the city like Lviv, where we are living, it just appears in different historiographies, right, and in different languages at the same time. So you actually have to communicate between historiographies in a way and connect, and that's a bit messy, but still, fun. And and thank you very much for your sharing your experience. And I think that will definitely go into the thinking, and probably into some emails we will be following up and asking.
Absolutely. And look, again, that's one of the things that I find most exciting about working in the digital is that you can be plural. When we work in print, we make a choice about doing one thing with our research and speaking to one audience, and we're very conditioned in that way to say that once we've said something about our research, then that's it. We can't do anything else with it. And I think that one of the things I've always tried to shift the thinking of my colleagues in history is to recognize that the digital allows you to do multiple things with your research for different audiences, for different historiographies. Now, we're absolutely not kind of trained or conditioned to do that. We're trained to kind of write our book or in our articles, and then we lock everything else up in filing cabinets, never to be seen again. Where actually, the the digital gives us opportunities to present different things for different audiences in different ways. And I think that that definition of scholarship that the American Historical Association put out a couple of years ago is beginning to kind of give that menu of choices to historians and say, actually, you can do all of these things. Because one of the tensions that's addressed is this tension between the people who are very much committed to an academic audience and therefore believe that any work addressed at other audiences is somehow devaluing the historical research, which is again, goes against everything that everybody in digital history has kind of learnt and done, and it comes from a very limited perspective on what happens. And so, to kind of address that, they're trying to get people to recognize that it's not an either or choice, that you can present your work in various ways. And obviously you have to if you want to engage with other audiences. So again, I think that, Digital Harlem was designed without an audience in mind. I think that's one of the things that's hardest to convey to people now is that we build it for ourselves and then kind of thought, well, okay, we built this thing and it doesn't just do what we've told it to do. So let's put it out there so other people can work with it, which is a very kind of, 2009 kind of view of the way things worked. And it's always been the biggest problem with the site as a result is that it's sort of not built for anyone in particular. Harlem and Disorder is oddly unconventional in being built primarily for an academic audience, where a lot of digital history has kind of given up that audience a little bit, or at least, there's a lot of tension about addressing it. I think in the US, it's become more of a just a trope that people repeat that digital history is kind of directed at the public, not at academics, when in fact, when you look, digital historians have been publishing all kinds of print articles based on their digital projects for a long time, without dislodging that idea that it goes different ways. But one of my lessons from Digital Harlem to Harlem and Disorder was that I couldn't really make the points about presenting a historical research for academics by designing something that would also be readily accessible to other readers. So this is a piece of academic scholarship, you know, designed for the range of readers who read that. So that includes students. I really hope that all of those sections about, all of the pages about interpreting sources and constructing stories that make transparent where that top narrative comes from, I really hoped was something that would be invaluable to student readers who are still, who still, often, as I said, struggle to recognize that that's going on when they're reading the narratives that we produce. And so that, the ability to go down and actually find that laid out. But again, that's still a process that is not necessarily going to make sense to a wider range of audiences. And so again, anybody can read it. It's an open access publication, but I, wasn't making any pretenses that it was for a wider audience than the audience that academic monographs usually have.
But it still doesn't have this, this one of the principles of public history is shared authority. And in a way, this, for academic audience, it does this sharing authority because you lay bare how, how you do the stuff, right? Which is more quoted than it's a paper publication, and it's more transparent, and maybe in a way also make one more vulnerable in a way that that's because it's that's. So yeah, sharing authority is not only about the relations between academics and public, but also can be relations within the academic field, right?
Absolutely. And vulnerable is a word that review and the American Historical Review used as well, which interestingly is not something I had thought about myself. This is very much the heart of what I do. As I said, I've always been ambivalent about narrative because of what is left out. So I guess I live in that layer, but it's interesting that a number of people have had that kind of reaction that making all of that transparent is both a sharing of authority, but also, is exposing you in a way that I guess I didn't feel myself, but it is another interesting reason, I guess, maybe why the shift to taking advantage of what you can do in the digital has been something historians have been reluctant to do. Because we do have this strange trust-based model for how we support our claims that doesn't expose you in the same way.
So we will ask you now if you could share us the review, if there's possible, if you could share with us the review, that would be lovely. I mean, it would be great because we do not have access. I think that it's harder for us to get from American historical.
Yeah, absolutely. I will drop it in an email.
Email to Roxolana, and then that would be good too.
Yeah. Again, it's exactly the kind of review that I would have wanted to write. So I'm very happy to share it, as opposed to some of the more ambivalent responses that it's got.
Yeah, thank you. I actually got a lot of inspiration from today's meeting and the conversation and thoughts about our digital. And it's for me, it's actually the process of making actually is much more, how to say, much more precious than the result, because you have this investigation and things and experimentation. What is the crucial, yes, for us in this in publications, project, whatever. Yeah, so I'm very thankful. So it was the last event in this year, in this series. I hope we will continue next year. So I'll keep you updated, and thank you again for the lecture.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. And again, I am very happy to continue any of this by email. So you have my email. Please reach out if there's anything you want to talk about or anything I can help with.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you.